What are the things you need for a portrait photo studio? Most would say that you probably need a good amount of space, a backdrop, some sort of lighting, a camera, and a subject. But what if you don't? I've done a whole bunch of videos on alternative ways to get a great portrait, from using work lights to moving furniture around to set up a scene. Today we'll talk about how you don't need a big space to have a studio. You don't even need to have a permanent space. No formal backdrop? No problem. A lot of people contact me wanting to set up some sort of temporary or movable studio space. They want to purchase studio lighting, maybe a backdrop, and have the opportunity to bring it out when they want to use it. I did a photo shoot with Raymond's help with studio lighting, my 2 strobes, but without a studio backdrop. I wanted some of the photos to look like I used a backdrop though. I used 3 areas in my home to act as the scene. A blank area of wall to get a studio look, some drapes to get an abstract sort of background, and a couch. Now, let's talk about how I decided upon those spots and what I did to make them work for this shoot. Before I get started, VIPs, like usual, I'm going to give you a lot more information on this shoot. It's in the June 27th, 2014 weekly VIP show, which is on snapchick.com right now. There, members will get Raymond's and my discussion of every single photo from the shoot, from hair and makeup to camera settings to post-processing adjustments, and we will each give you our individual perspectives. But for everyone right now, I'd like to give you an overview of the shoot and the 3 main things that I did to make my situation work for me. So the 3 main things that I did to make my situation work for me were I kept ambient light to a minimum, both physically and with camera settings. I limited my depth of field with my camera's aperture and the distances between the camera, the subject, and the background. And I got creative with composition and how I framed the subject. I'll talk about each of these things in the context of each of the situations. In my first scene, I wanted my photos to look like they were taken kind of in a studio, so I was against the blank wall and the curtains. And the blank wall was my first thought, but I didn't have a whole lot of blank wall space. I do have a narrowish area over by some windows, and I've got dark curtains on the windows themselves, so both of those areas were an option. They each have drawbacks though. My walls are textured, which isn't ideal, and the curtains are, well, they're curtains, so that isn't ideal either. Whichever of them I chose, I needed to blur them out behind me to mask the texture or folds. So I put as much distance as I could between the subject, me, and the wall. Then I used a wide enough aperture on my camera to keep the depth of field fairly shallow, where I was in focus, but what was behind me wasn't. So then it was a matter of placing the camera so that I had either curtains or wall behind me and not a mix of the 2. In many of the photos, I went with a lower key look so that you couldn't really see the wall behind me. To do that, I made sure there wasn't a lot of ambient light in the room, and I used the lowest ISO setting that I could. I didn't want a super sensitive sensor to pick up more light. I have to keep my shutter speed at a certain place because I was using strobes, and I was already using a fairly wide aperture to keep whatever background that you could see blurred out, so that left me with lights. I played with the power levels on my lights so that I was illuminated enough, but the environment around me was dark. So I was able to get some traditional looking portraits and some low-key portraits here, but I wanted something different, not the studio look. This is my orange couch. It's bright, it's shiny, and it's currently in the middle of Snapchick headquarters. That combination is not exactly ideal for taking any portraits, let alone retro-looking portraits. But why let those challenges stop us? Let's take them one by one. If the couch was simply bright, it wouldn't be a big deal because I knew the majority of the images would be black and white. However, the shiny finish on the couch is a pain, especially when using strobes, because you end up with places where the light is reflecting off of the couch. So, to take care of that problem, I grabbed a faux fur blanket that I found on clearance at Target a while back. I like to check out clearance sections there to find things that I can put away for use in photo shoots. So I draped the blanket over the couch and then just lied back on it. Now, the blanket doesn't cover the entire couch, and there is a very modern room around it. So to keep all of that out of the photo, I used similar tactics to the other photos. Creative framing, limiting ambient light, and keeping the depth of field shallow. First, I positioned the camera above me and had it looking down at me. I had the photo closely cropped so that you couldn't see the room around me. I still wanted a darkish look with a shallow depth of field too, because I didn't want the fur to really be on display either, so I continued to have a wide aperture and limit the ambient light. That way, I stood out in the frame. You may not have a portrait studio permanently set up. You may not even have all of the common studio equipment. Even if you do have those things, you won't always have the ideal situation for portraits. That doesn't mean that you can't get some great photos. Sometimes you just need to get a little creative and work with what you have. Throughout my shoot, I used the same few techniques to make my less than ideal situation work for me. I got creative with framing. You can do that anywhere. And I masked the area around me by keeping it dim and blurry. I have blackout drapes in this room so that I can get it dim during the sunny desert days, and I use camera settings and distances to limit the depth of field. If you need a little help with depth of field, you can even play around with a depth of field calculator. There are a bunch online, and there's even apps for your phone or your tablet where you enter the focal length, the aperture you plan to use, and your distance to the subject, and it will calculate the depth of field, what is going to be in focus in your scene. One last thing. I went with a black and white high contrast look with a retro spin for my photos. I have posted a sample image with some camera settings on snapcheck.com. You can find a link to the post in the description of this video. And VIPs, you can find the entire gallery of images when you log in there. And also VIPs. Like I said, I talked a lot more about this shoot in your weekly VIP show, which was posted this morning. I take you through my entire process with this shoot, and Raymond even talks a little bit as well about each photo in the gallery. If you haven't seen it already, you can find a link to that post when you log into the gallery. Just use the link in the description of this video. And I'm curious about you all. For this shoot, I worked around a challenging environment to get the look that I wanted. I used studio lighting, but I didn't have a backdrop set up. I just found areas in my home to use. Was there ever a time when you made your own studio setup? Was it in your home or somewhere else? Did you get creative with the surroundings? Tell me all about it in the comments.